Michael Jackson only ever publicly admitted to 2 nose jobs. That's what he wrote in his autobiography and what he told Oprah and the world. But when a board-certified plastic surgeon carefully studied his photos year by year, the evidence pointed to at least 10 separate rhinoplasties. By the final years of his life, the structure of his nose had almost completely collapsed, leaving what specialists grimly described as a nasal cripple. So why would the most gifted performer of his generation keep going under the knife until his face was barely holding together? Today we're going to walk through every surgery, every year, every hidden detail Michael tried to cover up, and finally face the real reason he could never stop. 1. Background in Michael's own words. For decades, Michael Jackson carefully controlled the story of his face. Whenever the subject of plastic surgery came up, he gave the same answer: calm, firm, and absolute. In his 1988 autobiography, Moonwalk, he wrote the words that would become his official version of events. I've had my nose altered twice, and I recently added a cleft to my chin, but that is it, period. 5 years later, sitting across from Oprah Winfrey in one of the most watched interviews in television history, he repeated the claim almost word for word. When Oprah pressed him on how many procedures he had undergone, Michael held up 2 fingers and said he could count them on those 2 fingers. He denied cheek implants, eye surgery, lip work, anything beyond the 2 nose jobs and the small cleft in his chin. Even in 2003, when British journalist Martin Bashir followed him with cameras for the controversial documentary Living with Michael Jackson, the King of Pop, stuck to the same line. The only work he had done on his face, he insisted, was on his nose, and even that, he claimed, was done for functional reasons. It helped him breathe better so he could hit higher notes. Cosmetic vanity, he suggested, was not the real motive. That was the story Michael wanted the world to believe. 2 nose jobs, 1 chin cleft, nothing more. But the evidence left behind after his death told a very different story. When the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office performed the autopsy in 2009, they found multiple surgical scars that did not match a simple 2-procedure history. There were scars inside and behind the nostrils, the classic marks of repeated rhinoplasties. There were also scars behind the ears, consistent with cartilage being harvested for nasal reconstruction. These findings quietly contradicted the neat public narrative Michael had maintained for more than 20 years. But the real reckoning did not come from Michael's own words. It came years later when independent plastic surgeons, men and women who had never treated him, who had no reason to protect his image, sat down with the only evidence that could not lie: the photographs. They lined up images from the late 1970s beside pictures from the mid-1980s, then the early 1990s, then the final years of his life. They measured the width of the bridge, the projection of the tip, the collapse of the side walls, the way the skin stretched thinner and thinner over a structure that was clearly failing. And the conclusions they reached were far more disturbing than anything Michael had ever admitted in public. Dr. Gary Linkoff, a New York facial plastic surgeon who specializes in complex rhinoplasty and revision cases, spent hours studying those side-by-side comparisons. His assessment was precise and unflinching. The visual record pointed to at least 10 separate rhinoplasty procedures, not 2, not 3, 10. Other specialists who examined the same photographs independently placed the number somewhere between 8 and 13. The exact figure may never be known with certainty because almost none of these operations were performed in major hospitals with transparent records. They took place in private clinics, behind closed doors, paid for in cash or through intermediaries, and deliberately kept off any public paper trail. What the images make impossible to deny is the progressive nature of the work. The first changes in the late 1970s still left a recognizable face. By the mid-1980s, the nose had been narrowed significantly. By the early 1990s, the side walls had thinned so dramatically that the external nasal valve, the very structure that allows a person to breathe through the nose, was compromised. In the later photographs, the bridge begins to sink, a classic sign of structural collapse known as saddle nose deformity. These are not the results of 2 careful, limited operations. They are the cumulative evidence of repeated surgical intervention over more than 2 decades. Michael had stood in front of the world and held up 2 fingers. He had written in his own book that the story ended there. He had told Oprah and Martin Bashir the same carefully rehearsed version, yet the face that appeared in photographs year after year kept changing long after that official number had been left behind. The gap between the public statements and the physical record is one of the most revealing and most tragic aspects of his entire story. The surgeries were private, the consequences were not. By the final years, the nose had been operated on so many times that its supporting framework was essentially gone. What remained was thin skin stretched over a weakened, reconstructed, and repeatedly revised structure, a condition some surgeons later described, without exaggeration, as an end-stage nose. The man who insisted he had only been under the knife twice had, in reality, subjected that one feature of his face to a level of surgical alteration that few patients ever experience in a lifetime. The gap between the carefully managed public statements and the physical evidence is one of the most revealing aspects of Michael Jackson's story. It shows a man who was determined to control not only how the world saw him, but how the world understood the changes happening to his face. He insisted the transformations were limited and necessary. The scars, the progressive narrowing of the nose, the eventual collapse of its structure, and the expert analysis all suggest something far more extensive and far more complicated. In the years that followed those early admissions, the public would watch Michael's face continue to change in ways that two surgeries simply could not explain. The story he told remained fixed. The face itself did not. What actually happened between those carefully chosen words and the final fragile state of his nose is what we need to examine next, year by year, surgery by surgery. 1. The timeline. Year by year, surgery by surgery. Let's start at the beginning, because the story of Michael Jackson's nose doesn't begin with vanity. It begins with an accident. In 1979, Michael was 21 years old. He was already a star, but the face the world knew was still largely the one he was born with. A wider nose, softer features, the same face that had smiled from Jackson 5 album covers. During a dance rehearsal, he took a hard hit to the nose. The official story says the injury made it difficult to breathe. Whether that was the full truth or just the acceptable reason, the result was the same. Michael went under the knife for the first time. That first rhinoplasty, performed when he was still so young, involved an allarplasty, narrowing the nostrils, along with building up the bridge and adding a tip graft for more projection. When the bandages came off, the change was noticeable but not shocking. The nose was thinner, more refined, yet it still looked like it belonged to him. Many people who saw him around the release of Off the Wall simply thought he had grown into his features. At that stage, the surgery could still be explained as both functional and cosmetic. It hadn't yet become a pattern. Then came the second operation, somewhere between 1981 and 1983. This time the surgeon was Dr. Stephen Heflin, a name that would stay connected to Michael for years. The nose became narrower still. The tip was refined into a sharper point. From the outside, the result looked elegant, almost delicate, but something important was already being lost. The lateral support of the nose, the side walls that keep the airways open, was starting to weaken. Years later, Heflin himself would acknowledge that this second surgery left Michael with new breathing difficulties. The very procedure meant to help him had begun to create the problem it claimed to solve. That quiet admission is one of the earliest cracks in the public story. From the mid-1980s through the early 1990s, the years of Thriller, Bad and Dangerous, the surgeries continued. It is difficult to pin exact dates to every procedure because so much of this work was private, but the visual evidence is relentless. Between roughly 1984 and 1993, Michael underwent a series of further operations, what many surgeons now count as procedures 3 through 6. Each one took a little more. The bridge was narrowed again. The tip was rotated upward, creating that distinctive button shape. The side walls of the nose grew thinner and thinner until, in some photographs, they appear almost absent. Here is the cruel irony. Michael had always insisted the surgeries were done so he could breathe better and hit higher notes. Yet every additional operation was making the external nasal valve smaller and weaker. Airflow was being restricted, not improved. The functional justification was collapsing at the same time as the structure of the nose itself. By 1994 and 1995, the changes became extreme. These are the operations many experts label as the 7th and 8th. The bridge was now extraordinarily narrow. The tip was tiny, almost pinched. The soft transition from the cheek into the side of the nose had disappeared. In profile, the nose no longer looked like a natural facial feature. It looked constructed and fragile. At this point, the cumulative damage was no longer subtle. The cartilage and bone that once gave the nose its strength had been reduced, reshaped, and reduced again until very little reliable support remained. Around the year 2000, the inevitable happened. The bridge began to sink. Surgeons call this a saddle nose deformity. The middle of the nose collapses because there is no longer enough structure underneath to hold the skin up. What had started as refinement had become structural failure. The ninth major intervention appears to have been an attempt to deal with this collapse, but by then the foundation was already compromised. In the final years, the approach changed from pure reduction to desperate reconstruction. Between 2001 and 2005, fillers, likely hyaluronic acid, were used to try to prop up the bridge. More dramatically, around 1998 or 1999, a German surgeon named Dr. Werner Mang was brought in. The situation was serious enough that cartilage was taken from Michael's own ear and grafted into the tip of the nose simply to give it some shape and support. Mang later issued a blunt warning: Michael should never again undergo aesthetic surgery on his face. The tissues were too damaged, the skin was becoming dangerously thin. Some analyses, including Dr. Gary Linkoff's careful review of later photographs, suggest that by 2005 there may have been yet another attempt at reconstruction, possibly using rib cartilage. Whether that final procedure happened exactly as speculated or not, the direction was clear. The surgeries were no longer about improvement. They were about holding something together that was falling apart. By the end, the skin over the nose was described as paper thin. Scars from repeated operations were visible under close examination. In some public appearances, Michael appeared to be using tape or temporary external support. New York plastic surgeon Dr. Pamela Lipkin, after studying photographs from those later years, used a phrase that still lands heavily. She called it an end-stage nose, a nasal cripple. In medical terms, it meant the structure had been operated on so many times that it had lost the ability to function or hold its form in any reliable way. This is the timeline the photographs force us to confront. What began in 1979 as a response to an injury, or at least as something that could still be explained that way, became a long, escalating series of procedures that progressively removed the very support the nose needed to survive. Michael's public statements remained fixed at 2 operations. The face itself kept changing long after that number had been left behind. And the question that hangs over every year on this timeline is the same one we started with. Once the damage became this severe, why did it never stop? 4. The secrets behind the knife. Behind the carefully staged public statements and the year-by-year changes in the photographs sits a darker layer of stories, the ones that rarely made it into the official narrative. For years, the name most closely tied to Michael Jackson's face was Dr. Stephen Hoeflin. Hoeflin was not an unknown doctor working in the shadows. He was a prominent Beverly Hills plastic surgeon whose client list included Elizabeth Taylor, Joan Rivers, and other major Hollywood figures. Michael trusted him with multiple procedures over a long stretch of time, but the relationship was not without controversy. In the 1990s, several former staff members made serious allegations against Hoeflin in legal filings and testimony. One of the most disturbing claims was that, on certain occasions when Michael arrived requesting further work on his nose, the surgeon would simply put him under anesthesia and then advance the clocks. Hours later, Michael would wake up believing another operation had been performed, when in reality almost nothing had been cut. The alleged motive was simple and chilling. The tissues of the nose were already so damaged that further cutting risked catastrophe, yet the patient kept returning. Whether every detail of those accusations is true remains disputed, but the fact that former employees were willing to put them on record paints a picture of a surgical relationship under extreme pressure. Then there is the question of how the entire process began. Scott Thorson, best known as Liberace's longtime companion, has claimed responsibility for the introduction that started it all. According to Thorson, he and Michael became close for a period in the late 1970s. When Liberace decided to have plastic surgery, Michael decided to have his nose done as well. Thorson says he introduced Michael to Liberace's personal surgeon, the late Dr. Jack Startz. On the day of the procedures, Thorson later recalled, the doctor arrived intoxicated and was injecting Liberace with Demerol while visibly impaired. Thorson said he had to take the needle away. Looking back years later, Thorson expressed a heavy sense of guilt, stating that he felt responsible for opening the door to Michael's long surgical journey. "That's what started the plastic surgery," he said. "He didn't like his nose. He always hated his looks." Whether this was truly the very first operation or one of the earliest, the story adds a chaotic, almost reckless beginning to what would become a decades-long pattern. Money is another part of the picture that is rarely discussed in precise terms. No complete public ledger exists, but estimates based on the number of procedures, the caliber of the surgeons involved, and the private nature of the workplace, the cumulative cost somewhere between $100,000 and $300,000 over the years, and that figure may still be conservative. In the world of high-end celebrity medicine in Los Angeles during those decades, repeated complex rhinoplasties and reconstructions were never inexpensive. There were also medical side effects that compounded the visual transformation. Cortisone injections, reportedly used to treat skin issues and inflammation, are known to thin the skin over time. When layered on top of multiple surgeries, the result was tissue that became increasingly fragile and less able to heal or hold structure. At the same time, Michael's battle with vitiligo, an autoimmune condition that causes loss of pigment, and the treatments used to manage the uneven appearance of his skin made every change to the nose more conspicuous. As the skin lightened and the facial features were altered, the progressive narrowing of the nose stood out more dramatically against the rest of the face. And then there is the psychological image Michael himself sometimes referenced. In conversations and interviews across the years, he spoke of his deep identification with Peter Pan, the boy who never grows up. Some accounts from those close to the surgical process claim that Michael described wanting a nose that resembled Peter Pan's, small, delicate, slightly upturned, frozen in a kind of permanent youth. Whether that specific request was stated in a surgeon's office or simply reflected a larger fantasy, it fits a pattern. The pursuit was never only about looking better. It was about looking like someone who did not age, someone who remained suspended outside ordinary time. These details, the celebrity surgeon under pressure, the alleged shortcuts in the operating room, the possibly drunken first introduction, the mounting financial and physical cost, the thinning skin, and the private fantasy of a never-aging face, do not appear in Michael's public explanations. They surface only when the official story is set aside and the quieter, more complicated record is examined. Together, they suggest that the surgeries were never simply a series of medical decisions. They were entangled with power, secrecy, addiction to an ideal, and a medical system that, for a long time, kept saying yes. 5. Why did he keep going? The hardest question is not how many times Michael Jackson went under the knife. It is why he could never stop. The first piece of the answer begins with his skin. Michael lived with vitiligo, an autoimmune condition that slowly erased the pigment from his body in uneven patches. For a global superstar whose image was scrutinized every day, the disease was both a medical reality and a public burden. He used strong medications and heavy layers of makeup to create an even appearance. As the skin grew lighter, the original features of his face, especially the wider nose of his youth, began to stand out more sharply against the changing complexion. Some who studied his transformation believed that part of the drive for repeated surgery was an attempt to make the face match the new skin. A narrower, more refined nose, they argue, felt more consistent with the lighter face he was presenting to the world. Whether this was a conscious choice or an unconscious response to the disease, the effect was the same. Every change in the nose became another step away from the face he had been born with. The second reason reaches much further back than any operating room. It begins in a small house in Gary, Indiana, under the control of a father whose methods of raising children bordered on the brutal. Joseph Jackson was not simply strict. He was a man who used fear, humiliation, and physical force as everyday tools. He beat his sons with belts, sticks, and his bare hands. He forced them to rehearse for hours until they collapsed. And among the many weapons he used against Michael, one of the most personal and lasting was the mockery of his appearance. Big nose? You look like a girl. You look ugly. These were not occasional insults. According to multiple accounts from family members and people who were present in those years, Joseph repeatedly singled out Michael's face, especially his nose, as something to be ridiculed. For a sensitive, deeply self-conscious child who was already performing under immense pressure, those words cut deeper than the physical punishments. They lodged themselves in his mind and never fully left. Years later, people who spent time close to the adult Michael would describe a quiet but relentless obsession. He wanted to erase every visible trace of the family he came from, not just emotionally, physically. He wanted a face that no longer carried the features Joseph had mocked, a face his father could no longer recognize or use as a weapon. Changing the nose, therefore, was never only about beauty or fame. It was an act of self-erasure and self-reinvention at the same time. Every surgery became another attempt to cut away the part of himself that had been laughed at when he was still a little boy standing in front of a mirror, listening to his father's voice. The operating table became the place where he tried to rewrite the face that had been turned against him. This is the part of the story that is rarely spoken about with full honesty. The public saw a global superstar transforming his appearance. What they did not see was the wounded child inside the man, still trying, decade after decade, to silence a father's cruel voice by literally reshaping the feature that voice had attacked. By the time Michael was rich enough and powerful enough to walk into any surgeon's office and demand another change, the original wound had already fused with something darker, the belief that the face he was born with was fundamentally wrong. The surgeries were not just cosmetic procedures, they were attempts at emotional surgery, desperate efforts to cut out the memory of being a child who was told, over and over, that he was not enough, that he was ugly, that his own face was a joke. And that is why the process never stopped, because no amount of cartilage removed or bridge narrowed could ever fully silence the voice of Joseph Jackson still echoing in his son's mind. The third reason is the most intimate and the most tragic. Michael repeatedly identified with Peter Pan, the boy who never grows up. "I am Peter Pan in my heart," he said. The fantasy was not just theatrical, it shaped how he wanted to look, delicate, youthful, suspended outside ordinary time. A small, slightly upturned nose fitted that image. At the same time, he described himself with painful honesty. "I'm never happy with what I see. I'm a perfectionist. It's part of who I am." That combination, an idealized, never-aging self-image and a relentless dissatisfaction with the real face in the mirror, is the classic ground for body dysmorphia. Once the pattern was established, two powerful forces kept it alive: almost unlimited money and the reluctance of highly paid surgeons to refuse a patient of his stature. When the person sitting in the consultation room is the most famous entertainer on earth, the word no becomes very difficult to say. Taken together, these three forces, the struggle with vitiligo and the desire for visual coherence, the long shadow of a father's cruelty, and the fusion of Peter Pan fantasy with perfectionist self-hatred, created a cycle that no single surgery could end. Each operation promised a better version of the face. Each one left him further from peace. By the time the structure of the nose itself began to fail, the psychological need had already outrun the physical possibility of repair. The tragedy is not simply that Michael Jackson changed his face, it is that he never found a version of it he could finally accept. In the end, the story of Michael Jackson's nose is not really a story about plastic surgery. It is the story of a gifted child who once smiled at the world with a completely natural face, wide, open, full of life, and who, year after year, allowed that face to be taken apart and rebuilt until almost nothing of the original structure remained. What began as one operation after an injury became a long, private war against his own reflection. The doctors held the knives. The money opened every door. But the driving force was always Michael himself, chasing a version of his face that never quite arrived. He gave the world music that still feels like it was sent from somewhere better than this planet. He gave us Thriller, Billie Jean, the moonwalk, the impossible voice that could sound both innocent and heartbreaking in the same breath. He gave everything he had to the stage and to the people who loved him. And yet he never gave himself the one thing that might have saved him: the permission to look in the mirror and finally say, "This is enough. This face is mine." Michael Jackson gave the world the most extraordinary music it has ever known. But he never allowed himself to love the real face he was born with. That is the quiet tragedy underneath all the headlines, all the photographs, all the speculation. The greatest entertainer of his generation spent decades trying to erase the very features that made him human. And by the time the structure of his nose began to collapse, the damage was no longer only physical. It had become permanent. So I leave you with two questions. How many surgeries is too many? And when a patient is rich enough and famous enough to keep asking, do the doctors still have a duty to say no? If this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, leave a comment and tell me where you stand. I read them. And if you want to go deeper into the secrets Michael carried all the way to the end, the ones that go far beyond the face, make sure you are subscribed. The next chapter is already waiting.